The paper made almost no sound when Callum pressed his pen to it, which was wrong, somehow, because it felt like the loudest thing he had ever done. He signed his name in full. No hesitation. No last look across the table at the woman who had arranged every detail of this meeting, the way she arranged everything else in her life, efficiently, without sentiment, in a room she had chosen. His lawyer had called it a pre-trial consent to dissolution. Vivienne's lawyer called it a formality. Callum set the pen down, pushed the paper across the polished boardroom table, and stood. Vivienne Holt watched him rise. She had the particular stillness of someone who had calculated an outcome so thoroughly that the moment itself had become merely administrative. Her eyes moved over him once, the practical watch, the off-the-rack jacket, the man she had introduced at firm events as my husband. He's in data work, and something at the corner of her mouth curved. Not unkind, just certain. Her attorney slid the papers into a folder with quiet efficiency. Callum picked up his jacket from the back of the chair, turned, and walked out through the glass doors and into the grave November afternoon in Vancouver, a sleeping 8-year-old boy heavy and warm against his shoulder, small hands curled into the lapel of his coat. Everyone in that room believed they had just watched him lose. The marriage had not ended on that Tuesday afternoon in a boardroom on the 20th floor of a building that smelled of new carpet and institutional ambition. It had ended slowly, the way light goes in November, without a moment you could name, until one day you looked up and it was simply dark. Callum Reid was 41. He had grown up in New Westminster, the second son of a pipefitter and a school secretary, and he had learned early that the work you did quietly was still work. After the twins came, Zara first, then Felix, 14 months later, and after the years had sorted themselves into the shape of two demanding careers sharing one house, it had become clear that someone had to anchor. Vivienne's career at the architecture firm was ascending in the specific and visible way careers ascend when the person inside them is genuinely good and also genuinely ruthless about time. She was good. She was worth watching. Callum had watched her and quietly became the person who made the anchoring possible. He drove the school route both ways. He knew which lunch combinations each child would actually eat and which they would trade away the moment they cleared the schoolyard gate. He knew the names of their teachers, their friends' parents, the particular stuffed rabbit that could not, under any circumstances, be absent from Felix's bed at lights out. He attended the parent-teacher interviews. He managed the pediatric appointments, the dental check-ins, the forms that came home in backpacks every second week like paper tides. And then, when both children were asleep and the house had exhaled, he went to the second bedroom, the one they had once called the guest room, and he worked. He was a software engineer by training and by nature. He had spent the early years of the marriage taking contracts because contracts fit around the other things, and the other things mattered more than his billable hours. Vivienne had never said this, but it did not need to be said. The shape of their life said it. To anyone watching from outside, Callum Reid was a man who had sacrificed his professional trajectory to his wife's. A man who had quietly stepped back. What those watchers could not see was the screen in the second bedroom, burning after midnight. 3 years earlier, Callum had identified a gap in the way mid-sized construction and engineering firms managed project documentation. The systems that existed were built for enterprises 3 times their size. Expensive, cumbersome, requiring IT infrastructure most regional firms didn't have. He had begun building something leaner, a cloud-based documentation and compliance platform designed specifically for the scale of firms that were too large for spreadsheets and too small for the systems the big players sold. He paid for none of it with shared money. This was not an accident. His grandmother had died when he was 35, and she had left him $60,000, the accumulated savings of a woman who had worked as a bookkeeper for 40 years and trusted him specifically because he reminded her of her late husband, who had been, as she once told Callum, a man who did things carefully and without fuss. He had kept that money in an account under his name alone. From it he bought cloud infrastructure, development licenses, the professional indemnity required to test the platform, with a handful of early clients. small engineering offices in Burnaby and Kelowna, which he found through a cousin who ran a structural consultancy out of Abbotsford. The intellectual property was registered to him alone. He told himself it was bookkeeping and went back to work. Vivienne never asked what he did in there. Once, in the first year, she might have. By the third year of the second bedroom's lamp burning late, she had stopped noticing the lamp. The night the marriage officially ended did not feel to Callum like an ending. It felt like a notification. Vivienne came home at 7:15 on a Wednesday, set her bag on the kitchen island with the particular weight of someone carrying a decision they had already made, and said she wanted a divorce. Her voice had the composure of someone who had rehearsed the words on the SkyTrain and found them satisfactory. She had already spoken to a lawyer. She had been thinking about this for a long time. They had grown in different directions. That was how she put it, grown in different directions. And the phrase was so careful and so bloodless that Callum stood at the stove with the pasta water starting to steam and understood he was not being asked a question. He had noticed, over the preceding months, a name appearing with increasing frequency on her phone screen. Not hidden, not flaunted, simply present. The way a name becomes present when the person carrying the phone has stopped caring whether you notice. Dex, short for something. A senior partner at a firm she had collaborated with on a commercial project in North Vancouver. Callum had not looked it up. He had just lived in the same house as the evidence and let it be what it was. He turned the burner down and finished making dinner because the children needed to eat. What undid him was not the dissolution itself. He had felt the marriage draining the way you feel a season turn imperceptibly, and then all at once. What undid him was the proposal that arrived from her attorney's office 4 days later. Vivienne would retain the house, which they jointly owned in East Vancouver, and which had appreciated considerably. She would retain the primary savings accounts. She would have primary custody of Zara and Felix, with Callum receiving alternating weekends. The reasoning was laid out in polished, regretful language that took care never to accuse him outright. Callum had no fixed employment contract. His income over the past 3 years had been inconsistent. Some contracts, some gaps, nothing a court could look at and call stable. He had no significant assets in his name. The children had spent the majority of their time in the family home, where their mother would remain. A man in his position, the document implied between every careful line, should be grateful for every other weekend. He read it twice at the kitchen table while Felix built a Lego spaceship on the floor beside him, narrating the mission in a low, continuous voice. Callum watched his son's hands, quick and certain, and entirely unaware, and felt something go cold and precise inside him. The worst part was that the document was accurate. Every line of it was technically true. He was the father who had done the invisible work, and invisible work left no trail a judge could weigh. He sat with the easy road for 3 days, because the easy road is always there and always reasonable. He could absorb the loss, take his every other weekend, avoid a legal war he couldn't obviously win against a firm partner's resources. There was a kind of peace available in that surrender. The peace of a man who has decided that the cost of fighting is higher than the cost of losing. What ended the easy road came on a Thursday night. Callum had finished the bedtime routine. Teeth, water, the appropriate stuffed rabbit located and confirmed in position, and he was sitting on the edge of Felix's bed in the half-dark when his son reached both arms up and wrapped them around his neck. Felix was 8, still young enough to hold on without knowing he was holding on. "Dad," Felix said into his shoulder. "You're not going to move far, right? Like, you'll still be close?" It was not a dramatic question. Felix asked it the same way he asked about whether submarines had Wi-Fi and why geese were allowed on the road. But it arrived somewhere below Callum's sternum and stayed there. "Yeah, bud," Callum said. His voice came out steadier than it felt. "I'll be close, I promise. I'm not going anywhere." He sat on the edge of that bed long after Felix's breathing had deepened, and his hands had loosened one finger at a time against the collar of Callum's shirt. Down the hall, Zara had her light on, reading past her bedtime as she always did. Somewhere across the city, a legal file was being assembled, by people who had never met his children. They had drawn a corridor 2 weekends wide and called it fatherhood. Callum sat in the dark and understood with the specific, settled clarity of a man who has stopped negotiating with himself that he would not sign a single line of it. The decision did not come as anger. Anger would have burned and gone by morning. What arrived instead was the same patience that had carried him through 3 years of midnight sessions. Unhurried, exact, and very hard to move. The next morning, after the school drop-off, he sat in his car in the parking lot of the elementary school and made a call. He had spent 2 days asking quietly through his professional network for a name, the way you ask when you need someone good enough that they're slightly frightening, and one name had come back from 3 different people. A family lawyer in downtown Vancouver. Not the kind whose face appeared on bus shelter ads. The kind whose name other family lawyers mentioned in a slightly lower register. The call connected on the 3rd ring, a Bernathy. A woman's voice, clipped and unhurried. "My name is Callum Reed," he said. "I think my wife is about to take my children, and I think she's counting on me being too reasonable to stop her." A brief, assessing silence. That's a specific way to put it. "Yes, what's your situation?" he told her. Freelance engineer, no fixed contract. No assets in his name in the public record. 3 years of midnight work on a platform that existed in its entirety outside the marriage financial structure. A grandmother's inheritance, kept separate, servers and licenses bought from that account alone. Intellectual property registered to him. Margaret Abernathy listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Come in tomorrow at 8. Bring every record you have. Account statements, purchase receipts, registration documents, anything time-stamped. And Mr. Reed, don't sign anything. Not even something that looks administrative. Not a school form that goes through her lawyer, nothing." A pause. "Not a Christmas card." Callum almost smiled. "I wasn't planning to." That evening he made pasta because it was what the children asked for, and because routine had become a kind of defiance. He helped with homework at the kitchen table. Listened to Zara's detailed account of a conflict among her friends that seemed to involve complex territorial rights to a specific lunch table, read 2 chapters of a novel about a boy who could talk to birds, confirmed the rabbit's position, and only then walked to the 2nd bedroom and turned on the lamp. The platform waited on the screen where he had left it the night before. 14 months of clients, 2 of them now renewals. 26 engineering and construction firms across BC and Alberta onboarded quietly, without pitch decks, through word of mouth and a cousin's referral network that had grown in directions. Callum had stopped trying to predict. He sat down in front of the screen and understood, perhaps for the first time with full clarity, that what he had built in this room might be the only thing standing between his children and every other weekend. He just did not yet know how large that thing was. Margaret Abernathy's office was on the 16th floor of a building near Burrard Station, and the morning light came off the water in a way that left the room very clear. She read the initial filing from Vivienne's attorney without expression, squared the pages with 2 fingers, and looked at Callum the way someone looks at an X-ray when they already suspect what they are going to find. "On paper," she said, "you look like a man with no ground to stand on." He had braced for softness and was grateful she hadn't offered it. "No employment contract. Income that a court will read as irregular. No real property in your name. Her team won't say you're a bad father. That's too blunt and they know it. They'll say you're a dependent father. A man who contributed in ways that were valuable and impossible to quantify. They'll be generous about it, which makes it harder to argue against." "And the platform?" Callum asked. "Tell me about it. Not the technical parts. The parts a judge would care about. Money. Time. Whose resources?" So he told her. The inheritance from his grandmother received before the marriage, never put into their joint accounts. The separate account that bore his name only. Every infrastructure purchase, every license, every development tool, bought from that account and no other. The intellectual property registered to him individually. The work done after midnight, in the hours that belonged only to him. She listened without writing anything down. "Better than you know," she said when he finished. British Columbia starts from the assumption that property acquired during a marriage is family property. The default is against you. What you've described isn't a defense yet, it's the materials for one. What I need is every timestamp, every receipt, every record that places this work and this funding outside the marriage. We're going to prove that what you built was yours before the court decided you had nothing, and we're going to prove it on paper, because everything else disappears in front of a judge. Before he left, she gave him one instruction that surprised him. Agree to the dissolution, she said. Sign that consent and nothing else. Don't fight the divorce itself. You don't want the marriage either, and a man who contests a divorce looks bitter in front of a judge. But the house, the accounts, the children, you concede nothing. You sign one document, you walk out, and you let everyone in that room think whatever they want to think. She held his gaze steadily. The most useful thing you can do right now is let them underestimate you. 2 weeks later, in the boardroom of Vivienne's attorney's firm, that was what he did. He signed the consent to dissolution and walked out with Felix asleep on his shoulder and the rest of the war still ahead of him. The months that followed taught Callum what a politely waged campaign of attrition felt like. Vivienne's legal team never raised its voice. It didn't need to. It applied pressure in the small, consistent way that water finds stone, a request for a psychological assessment of Callum, framed as routine, a procedural box to check, while the implications settled into the air like weather. Is he stable? Is he managing? Can a man whose professional life looks like his be trusted with the primary care of 2 children? The visitation schedule eroded quietly. A Saturday pickup shifted to Sunday because of an unspecified conflict. One weekend was canceled. The children had plans with Vivienne's family, who were up from Victoria, and the timing was unfortunate. When Callum called the house, Felix answered and asked 3 times when his dad was coming. Callum understood what the pattern was. He was being shown the cost of continuing. He was being taught, one weekend at a time, what it would feel like to give up. He did not give up. But he did not sleep much. The thing that changed the shape of everything came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in Margaret's office. She was reading something on her screen, and when she spoke, her voice had the particular quality of someone being deliberately careful. "Callum," she said, "are you aware that there's an acquisition offer on your platform?" He went very still. "No." She turned the monitor toward him. A technology investment group based in Calgary with a satellite presence in Vancouver. The offer was preliminary, no signature, nothing public, but the valuation they had put forward was in 7 figures. Solidly. "Did you approach them?" "I never pitched it to anyone." His voice was quiet and even. "I made one module of the core architecture publicly available, open source, under my name, about 8 months ago, to see whether it held up under outside scrutiny. I never told anyone it was for sale. I was going to." He stopped. He had been going to finish it. He had been going to tell Vivienne, and the timing of that unfinished sentence arrived in his chest like something cold. Margaret was watching his face with precision. "Here is what I want you to sit with," she said, "because I've been doing this for 19 years and I've learned to be suspicious of convenient timing." She pulled up a second document. A third. The dissolution filing has a date. The first correspondence between Vivienne's attorney and the firm's internal counsel has a date. And now I have a preliminary offer with a date. She looked at him. "Vivienne's new partner, the one from North Vancouver. Do you know what sector he works in?" Callum thought about it. "Infrastructure development. Mostly commercial and residential, investment adjacent. His firm has relationships with the same capital networks that produced this offer." She did not raise her voice. It simply sharpened. She didn't move slowly and then get surprised by your success. She moved fast. She filed before this could surface because once it surfaces, it's an asset. An asset she'd have to fight you for openly, with a judge watching. It's far cleaner to take the house and the accounts from a man everyone believes has nothing, and be gone before anyone realizes what he was actually holding. Callum sat with it. He felt the floor of everything he had understood about the past year tilt and reseat. He had been carrying himself like a man accepting an unfair situation with as much grace as he could manage. He had even, in the private dark of the second bedroom, felt something that was almost close to pity for himself. A man who had done the quiet work for years and was being efficiently discarded. But that was not the story. She had not left because he was going nowhere. She had left because she had somehow understood that he was about to arrive, and she intended to hold the deed when he did. He was not being discarded. He was being harvested. The pity left him cleanly, and something sharper and much colder moved into the space where it had been. "All right," he said. "All right." Margaret agreed, and he noticed, for the first time since he had met her, that the corner of her mouth moved almost imperceptibly. Vivienne moved differently once she understood he was not going to break. It came through professional channels, through decks, through the particular social gravity of people who moved in interconnected Vancouver business circles. A quiet fog of doubt began seeding itself into the questions around their complications with ownership. Was the founder midway through a contentious family court proceeding? Unresolved questions made investment groups cautious. Any prudent fund would want to wait until the situation clarified. It was the corporate equivalent of the psychological evaluation, unanswerable, designed to linger. And then she came to him directly. Callum had taken a furnished apartment in Mount Pleasant for the duration. 2 bedrooms, both children with him on his current schedule, a table by the window where he worked when they were at school. The knock came on a Thursday evening while Zara and Felix were asleep. Vivienne stood in the doorway in a coat that made the hallway look shabby by comparison. She did not ask to come in so much as move slightly forward until he stepped back. She looked around the apartment with an expression that was not contempt exactly. Something more considered than contempt, something almost like pity. And then she made her offer. A settlement, a confidentiality agreement, a sum that was not insulting. In exchange, she would release the quiet pressure on the acquisition. The deal would go through. He would walk away with enough to start over. "You're a better father than you are an entrepreneur, Callum," she said, and her voice was not unkind. "That's not a criticism. It's just the truth. Don't walk into a room you weren't built to stand in." He looked at her for a long moment, at the woman he had married when they were both unremarkable, who had counted every card before the game began. "Go home, Vivienne," he said quietly. She studied him. She was very good at reading rooms, and she read this one accurately. Then she left, her boots precise on the halva floor, and the door clicked shut. But after the parking lot below had gone dark and quiet, Callum sat at the window table alone and let the doubt arrive. Because he had learned not to refuse it, only to sit with it and wait for it to pass. He thought about what he was asking his children to move through. The canceled weekends, the assessments, the long, low-grade uncertainty of a fight this size. In the next room, Zara had thrown one arm off the edge of her bed in her sleep, which was something she had done since she was a toddler. Felix had the rabbit in the approved location. A child, he thought, doesn't need a father who wins. They need a father who stays. He didn't have an answer by morning. He only had the work and the promise, so he kept going. The floor fell out 7 days before the hearing. It surfaced as a short item on a technology news site, the kind of post that circulates before anyone checks the sourcing. It described the pending acquisition of Callum's platform inaccurately and, more importantly, damagingly, characterizing the project as carrying unresolved intellectual property questions tied to ongoing family court proceedings. It was written to sound like diligent reporting and engineered to sound like risk. Within 48 hours, the investment group had requested a pause in negotiations pending legal review. A 7-figure offer does not vanish overnight, but it can go cold, and Callum felt it cooling in real time. The same morning, Vivienne's legal team filed a supplemental petition with the court, a request to freeze all assets connected to the platform pending the resolution of the proceedings. If granted, the acquisition would stall indefinitely. The one thing that could prove Callum's financial standing would be locked behind a legal hold until long after the custody question was decided. Margaret called him at noon. "If the freeze is granted," she said without preamble, "the deal stalls. We're back to exactly where they wanted you from the beginning." A man with no provable assets fighting for his children on their terms. She did not soften it. I won't tell you it's over, but I'll tell you it's as close as we've come. Callum stood at the window of the Mount Pleasant apartment and looked down at the street. There's one more thing, she said, and her voice shifted by that fraction he had learned to notice. I've been tracing the leak. That news item was not a journalist finding a story. The specific language in it, the framing around the IP complications, the family proceedings, that information existed in exactly 2 places. I've spent the last 4 days building the chain of contact. He waited. The story went from Vivienne to Dex to a contact at a communications consultancy who has placed stories before. I have the messages. Not complete, but enough. A precise, quiet beat. Someone handed a reporter a weapon, Callum, and I can show the court which hands passed it. He watched the street below for a moment. Then we show them. We show them, she agreed. Outside, the afternoon pressed toward evening and the hearing was 7 days away, and Callum Reed, who everyone in that first boardroom had agreed had nothing, put his phone down and went to wake his children for dinner. The morning of the hearing came in clear, the kind of late autumn Vancouver day that is cold and bright and takes no position on what happens beneath it. Callum was dressed before 6. He made the children's lunches, even though they would not be at school, habit, and something to do with his hands, and dropped Zara and Felix with his sister in Burnaby, crouching at the door to straighten Felix's collar, promising both of them he would be back by dinner. He was standing at the curb outside the apartment building when a car pulled up. Not the kind of car that parks easily in Mount Pleasant, low, dark, and conspicuously unhurried. The man who leaned across to open the passenger door was named Preston Cole. Callum knew the name without knowing the face. Cole was the principal partner of the investment group that had put forward the acquisition offer, the money at the center of everything. He was 60-something, with the unhurried manner of a person for whom most urgency had been resolved by wealth. "Get in," Cole said. "Traffic's lighter than it looks. You want to be early. Let them watch you walk up." Callum got in. For several blocks, Cole said nothing, letting the city move past the windows. Then, one of my analysts kept returning to the same open repository. "Yours," said the architecture was the cleanest and most purposeful thing he'd looked at in 2 years, and that it was sitting publicly under a real name with no pitch attached to it. "Nobody sends me work without a pitch. You didn't send me anything." He glanced over. "I wanted to know what kind of person does that." A few blocks from the courthouse, Cole pulled to the curb and stopped the engine. Then he got out, walked around, and opened the driver's door. "You take it from here," he said. "Your hearing, your car. I'll get in the other side." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a smile, but close. "And it doesn't hurt for certain people to see who got out of the passenger seat." Callum looked at him for a moment. He understood the gift and the cold strategy folded inside it. Then he slid behind the wheel. The courthouse steps were occupied when the car turned the corner and rolled to a stop. A few journalists. The acquisition offer had made enough noise in the local business press that a custody case attached to it was a story that wrote itself. Vivienne's lead counsel was already climbing the steps, a thick accordion of files under one arm. Standing near the doors, hands in his jacket pockets, was Dex. Not the name, Callum had learned, but close enough. A man named Daxton, who had attended as though he expected to watch a conclusion being formalized. The car door opened and Callum stepped out. He was unhurried. He straightened his jacket. He was the man everyone in that first boardroom had watched agree to lose everything, and he was stepping out of a car that cost more than a year of what they had estimated he was worth. Preston Cole emerged from the passenger side a moment later and buttoned his jacket without speaking, and that detail, the investor on the passenger side, traveled across the steps. In a quiet murmur as people recognized the name, Callum did not look at Daxton for long. He watched the calculation move across the man's face. The sudden, visceral recalibration of someone who has realized that the board he understood had pieces on it nobody told him about. Then Callum walked up the steps and through the doors. Inside, Vivienne's confidence held for precisely as long as it took Margaret to open her folder. The courtroom was formal and still. The judge was a woman in her late 50s with the patient and specifically unyielding expression of someone who had listened to thousands of people perform certainty and had stopped being moved by the performance. Vivienne's team led with what Margaret had predicted to the word: a devoted but inconsistent home life. A father of evident goodwill, but without demonstrable stability. A mother prepared to offer the children continuity, professional security, a life structured around their needs. They were precise and warm, which was the most dangerous combination. Then Margaret stood up. She did not raise her voice once. She began with dates. She laid them down one at a time. The date of the dissolution filing. The dates of the earliest communications between Vivienne's attorney and the firm's internal legal department, and against them, the date the investment group's interest in Callum's platform had first appeared in the paper record. The two timelines lay side by side in the transcript like a photograph. The petitioner did not discover this project late, Margaret said in the tone of someone reading a weather report. She discovered it early, and she structured the timing of this entire proceeding around exiting the marriage before that asset could surface and require transparent division. An objection. The judge allowed Margaret to continue. Then came the leak. Margaret produced the chain her team had spent a week reconstructing. The specific language in the news item, the framing around the IP complications, the family proceedings, traced back not to any journalist's investigation, but to a communication that moved from Vivienne to Daxton to a third party at a media consultancy who had a documented history of placing similar items for clients. She laid it out step by careful step. The disruption to these negotiations was not market caution, she told the court. It was constructed. And it was constructed by a party acting in coordination with the petitioner for the purpose of eliminating the respondent's only significant asset before this court could consider it. Quiet and unmistakable. Vivienne's attorneys had a brief, sharp exchange in whispers, the sound of a team discovering that the foundation they'd built on had a cavity nobody had inspected. Through the narrow window in the courtroom door, Callum caught a single glimpse of Daxton in the corridor, turning and walking unhurriedly toward the exit. He did not come back. Margaret closed the property question the way she had promised she would, brick by brick. The grandmother's inheritance, received before the marriage and never entered into the joint accounts. The separate account bearing Callum's name only, every infrastructure purchase, every license, every development tool, bought from that account and documented. The intellectual property registration, the work done after midnight funded by separate money, outside the shared hours and resources of the marriage. She acknowledged the BC Family Law Act's default presumption of family property plainly, and then she dismantled its application to this case piece by documented piece until the presumption had nowhere left to stand. This was not built with family property, she said, when she had laid the last document. It was not built during family time. It was not built with the knowledge or contribution of the petitioner. The attempt to freeze it is an attempt to capture something that was never subject to division. She sat down. The courtroom was very quiet. The judge set aside the filings and looked at Callum directly, with the particular attention of someone who has heard all the law they need and is now looking for the person underneath it. "Mr. Reed," she said, setting the financial questions aside for a moment, "tell me in your own words why you're asking for primary custody of your children." Callum stood. He did not reach for the platform or the acquisition or the documentation that had just been ruled in his favor. None of that had ever been the point. "A few weeks ago," he said, "I was sitting on the edge of my son's bed, after lights out. He put his arms around my neck and asked me if I was going to stay close." His voice held, low and steady. He wasn't worried. He was 8. He was just asking the way he asks about everything. But I've thought about that question every day since. He paused. "Everything I've done over the past months, I've done because of what I said to him that night. I told him I wasn't going anywhere. I want primary custody of Zara and Felix because I'm the person who has been there, and I don't want to become the reason that answer was a lie." No one said anything. The judge looked at him for a moment, nodded once, made a note. The silence held until she spoke again. The rulings arrived in order. The petition to freeze the platform assets was denied. The acquisition, the court found no reason to obstruct, would proceed. On custody, the judge awarded primary care to Callum, with a defined and regular schedule for Vivienne. On the property question, the court held what Margaret had argued. The platform was Callum's separate property, developed independently, funded by separate premarital funds, outside the shared resources of the marriage. Vivienne received her lawful share of the family property they had genuinely built together. Not a dollar more. Callum watched his ex-wife receive the decision. She was composed. She was always composed. But there was a stillness in her face that had not been there in the boardroom 3 months earlier. The stillness of a person who has run a careful calculation and found, at the end of it, that they miscounted. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Preston Cole was waiting with his hands in his coat pockets. He offered his hand, and Callum took it. "You want to know why I drove down here this morning?" Cole said. "It wasn't the platform. I made the decision on the platform weeks ago." He held the handshake a moment longer than necessary. "I came to see how you'd carry the weight. You can learn almost everything you need to know about a person by watching them under pressure." He let go. "We'll get the paperwork finished this week." The deal closed 11 days later. Callum did not celebrate it. He did not post about it or call anyone to describe what the number was. What he did with the first significant money he had ever held was buy a house in Coquitlam, small, single-story, a yard that was mostly unambitious lawn, and one large cedar that had clearly been there longer than the neighborhood. It needed work. It was his, and it was theirs. That first night, he made dinner, because that was what he had always done, and he saw no reason to change the thing that had held. He helped Felix with a worksheet on subtraction, watched Zara read past her bedtime with the lamp angled in a way that she clearly believed was invisible from the hallway, found the rabbit, confirmed its position, and checked twice. When the house had settled and gone quiet, he carried a cup of tea to the back step and sat in the dark under the cedar tree, and felt the specific, uncomplicated weight of having told the truth in a room full of people who had expected him to lie down. He saw Vivienne once, about 6 weeks after the house. A school concert. Gymnasium, folding chairs, 40 children singing with varying degrees of conviction about winter. She was as composed as ever, still capable of making a room acknowledge her, though something around her eyes had shifted slightly, something that polish did not entirely cover. He had heard, in the way these things travel, that whatever had existed between her and Daxton had not survived the exposure of what they had done together. He found, sitting in the folding chair, that he felt nothing particular about that. Not satisfaction, not relief, just a kind of settled absence where the bitterness might have lived. They stood near the back of the gymnasium afterward and traded a few necessary sentences about the holiday schedule, about a permission form for a field trip, about whether Felix's winter boots from last year would last another season. There was no heat in it on either side, 2 people sharing, 2 children and very little else. Vivienne turned to leave, then stopped. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read, something more complicated than regret and less performative than an apology. "I didn't realize how far along it was," she said quietly. "The platform." She meant the platform. Callum looked at her for a moment. There were a dozen things that had lived in him over the past year. Grief and anger and the long, cold clarity of someone who has understood they were being used. He could have said any of them. A year ago he might have wanted to. "I know," he said. That was all. He turned and crossed the gymnasium floor to where Felix was waiting with a paper snowflake he had made in class, slightly crumpled from being held too long, and Zara was beside him already explaining why the performance would have been better if the music teacher had chosen different songs. Callum crouched, smoothed out the snowflake, folded it carefully into his jacket pocket, and took both of their hands, and walked out through the gymnasium doors into the cold December night. There was no triumph in it. No score being settled, no moment that looked the way movies say moments look. There was only a man who had stayed when staying was hard, who had kept a promise made in the dark to a boy who asked the way children ask, simply, without strategy, with the whole weight of their trust behind it, and who walked out into the ordinary cold with a hand in each of his, and everything that actually mattered still intact.